On the 5th of January 1942, as jubilant shouts of victory echoed through the streets of Tokyo, the mood inside the highest levels of Japan's naval command was far more complex. While civilians celebrated what appeared to be an unstoppable march across the Pacific, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Combined Fleet, was already thinking beyond triumph. From aboard the massive battleship Yamato, the pride of the Japanese Navy, Yamamoto instructed his senior officers to begin preparations for what he called the second stage of operations in the Pacific War. The first phase, launched in December 1941, had exceeded expectations. Reports from the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, and the islands of the Western Pacific painted a picture of near-total success. Japanese troops were advancing with breathtaking speed. In a matter of weeks, forces of the Empire had shattered British, Dutch, and American defenses that had taken decades to construct. To many in Tokyo, this was proof of destiny, confirmation that Japan was invincible. Yamamoto did not share their certainty. Based on intelligence summaries and operational reports flowing into Combined Fleet headquarters, Yamamoto believed that within a few months Japan would effectively control East Asia and much of the Western Pacific. That reality, however, raised a far more dangerous question: what came next? He told his Chief of Staff, Admiral Matomi Ugaki, that plans for future operations must be completed by mid-February. Time, Yamamoto believed, was Japan's most precious and most limited resource. The astonishing speed of Japan's conquest stunned even its own military planners, but success bred conflict. Inside the Imperial General Staff, a sharp divide emerged. On one side stood the ardent military nationalists, officers who believed that victory itself justified endless expansion. As long as Japan continued to win, they argued, there should be no limit to how far the war should be pushed. Opposing them was a smaller, quieter group of naval officers who viewed the situation with growing unease. Yamamoto stood at the center of this faction. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Yamamoto had never welcomed war with the United States or Britain. He understood their industrial strength, their manpower reserves, and their capacity to recover from early defeats. He had studied America closely, not from books but firsthand. From 1926 to 1928, Yamamoto had served as Japanese naval attaché in Washington. He had traveled across the United States, observed its factories, spoken with its officers, and witnessed its economic power. What he saw left a lasting impression. Japan, he believed, could strike hard, but it could not endure a long war against the Western powers. These views made Yamamoto a dangerous man in Tokyo. So intense was the hostility toward his opinions that friends within the Imperial General Staff feared for his life. They worried that if Yamamoto remained in the capital, extremists might assassinate him for opposing the doctrine of unlimited war. That fear alone was enough to keep him at sea, commanding the fleet from the Yamato rather than from a desk in Tokyo. Even from afar, Yamamoto made no effort to hide his concerns. Admiral Ugaki recorded in his diary the need for far-sighted statesmanship following what he called the first month of glorious victory. Those words, far-sighted statesmanship, were Yamamoto's own. He used them often, especially when warning that Japan could not hope to defeat the Western powers in a prolonged conflict. His criticism extended beyond military strategy. Yamamoto openly questioned the judgment of Japan's political leadership, particularly Prince Konoe and others who, in his view, had plunged the nation into war without a clear understanding of how such a conflict could or should be fought. 3 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had shared his fears privately with an old friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa. Sasakawa was president of the ultra-nationalist Kokusuido organization and a man with deep connections among Japan's right-wing political elite. The two met at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba, where Yamamoto spoke with unusual frankness. War, he said, was inevitable, not because Japan desired it, but because political decisions had already set events in motion. At first, Yamamoto predicted, Japan would have everything its own way. The empire would expand rapidly, like an octopus spreading its tentacles across the Pacific. And indeed, by January 1942, that prediction seemed to be coming true. The octopus lay spread almost flat across the map. Yet Yamamoto warned that this euphoria would not last. He believed the critical moment for political action would come with the fall of Singapore. Such a catastrophe, he argued, would deeply unsettle Britain and could trigger unrest throughout India. In that moment of weakness, Yamamoto believed the British might be willing to listen to proposals for peace. Yamamoto knew the British well. He had served on the Japanese delegations to the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He understood British naval thinking and British limitations, and he knew something else. Once the politicians had started the war, Japan had to win a major victory quickly. Without it, the nation would face disaster. Even then, Yamamoto believed Japan would have no more than a year and a half to enjoy its success. "We must secure a peace agreement by then," he told Sasakawa. He hoped his friend would quietly spread that message among the powerful right-wing leaders who now dominated Tokyo. On January 5th, 1942, victory appeared close enough to touch. The American battleship fleet lay crippled at Pearl Harbor. British capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse had been sunk off the Malayan coast. In the Philippines, Manila had fallen, and the U.S. naval base at Cavite had been captured. Hong Kong had surrendered. Japanese troops were already preparing new landings across the Dutch East Indies, New Ireland, Ambon, and the Solomon Islands. Yet despite these triumphs, Pearl Harbor had not delivered what Yamamoto had truly wanted. The aircraft carriers of the United States Navy, the most dangerous elements of its fleet, had not been destroyed. They had been at sea on December 7. Now they remained a constant, unpredictable threat. What Japan needed, Yamamoto believed, was a spectacular achievement, a victory so decisive that it would shatter enemy morale and force negotiations. He did not expect Singapore to fall for another 5 or 6 months. In reality, it would collapse far sooner, on February 15, 1942. But even that victory, Yamamoto suspected, would not be enough. If Japan was to shape the war's end, it would need to strike in an entirely new direction. The question facing Yamamoto and his planners was simple, but dangerous: where to strike next. One possibility was an attack on the Soviet Union. Yamamoto raised the idea cautiously, but the army vetoed it almost immediately. Such a campaign would be fought largely on land, and the army was already heavily committed in China and Southeast Asia. 3 other proposals emerged. Yamamoto's preferred option was audacious: an advance into the Indian Ocean. The plan envisioned an invasion of Ceylon, the destruction of the British Far Eastern Fleet, and a push toward the Middle East. There, Japanese forces could link up with the Germans advancing toward the Caucasus oil fields, securing Japan's access to vital resources. The army rejected the plan outright. That left 2 alternatives. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo favored an operation against Australia. By seizing island chains in the South Pacific, Japan could isolate Australia and deprive the Americans of a forward base. The plan called for capturing New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa after moving into the Solomon Islands. Some planners went so far as to begin drafting occupation schemes for Australia and New Zealand. Yamamoto was unimpressed. The Australia plan, he believed, would take too long. Worse, it would fail to deliver the kind of dramatic victory needed to stop the Americans. He also knew that the attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened something dangerous in the United States: a spirit of vengeance. The Japanese had long dismissed Americans as soft and incapable of sustained war. Yamamoto knew better. Even the capture of Singapore, he believed, would not break American resolve. What Yamamoto wanted was a victory that would allow Japan to extend what he called a generous olive branch, a victory that would make peace possible on Japan's terms. In January 1942, he ordered a new plan to be drawn up. 2 months later, selected officers were sent to Tokyo carrying a document known as the MI Plan. It envisioned a decisive battle near Midway Island where Japan would lure the American carrier force into combat and destroy it. Alongside it was the AL Plan, which proposed operations through Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. If everything went well, Hawaii might eventually be occupied, and perhaps even the American West Coast threatened. At the very least, victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would give Japan's politicians a foundation for negotiating the kind of peace Yamamoto hoped to achieve. Inside the Navy Ministry, admirals argued bitterly around the conference table, but in the end, Yamamoto prevailed. What many forgot or chose to ignore was that the fall of Singapore and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor might already have served Yamamoto's purpose. Then came April 1942. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led a squadron of B-25 bombers in a daring raid on Tokyo. Militarily, the damage was minor. Psychologically, it was devastating. The raid shocked Japan into a grim realization: the Americans were not broken. They were only beginning to fight. The Doolittle Raid of April 1942 struck Tokyo like a thunderbolt. Though the physical damage was minimal, the psychological impact was profound. For the first time, Japanese civilians saw enemy aircraft in their skies. The illusion of absolute security so carefully cultivated by military propaganda was shattered overnight.
For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the raid confirmed his worst fears. The Americans were not intimidated. They were adapting. Within days, Yamamoto used the raid to strengthen his case for immediate, decisive action. The United States, he argued, must be forced into a climactic naval battle before its industrial power could be fully mobilized. Time once again became the enemy. The solution, Yamamoto believed, lay at Midway. The gamble at Midway. Midway Island was a tiny coral atoll barely visible on most maps. Yet its strategic importance was immense. Located roughly halfway between Japan and Hawaii, Midway served as a forward American outpost, one that threatened Japan's eastern perimeter. Yamamoto's plan was complex, ambitious, and deeply risky. Under the MI plan, Japanese forces would attack Midway, drawing out the U.S. Navy's remaining aircraft carriers. Once exposed, the American carriers would be destroyed by Japan's superior carrier force, restoring naval dominance in the Pacific. To distract American attention, Yamamoto approved the AL plan, sending a separate force to attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. This diversion, he believed, would stretch American defenses thin and conceal the true objective. The plan reflected Yamamoto's belief in decisive battle, a single overwhelming engagement that would settle the war at sea. But the plan also revealed Japan's growing weakness. Japan no longer possessed the overwhelming advantage it once had. Carrier pilots lost at Pearl Harbor in the Indian Ocean, and during months of relentless operations could not be replaced quickly. Aircraft production lagged behind American output. Fuel supplies were already under strain. Even worse, the MI plan divided Japan's forces across thousands of miles of ocean. Yamamoto himself remained far to the rear, commanding from the Yamato, separated from the carrier strike force that would fight the decisive battle. Communication delays and rigid command structures would soon prove fatal. What Yamamoto did not know, what no one in Tokyo suspected, was that the Americans were waiting. The codebreakers. By early 1942, U.S. naval intelligence had made a critical breakthrough. Cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had partially broken the Japanese Navy's operational code, JN-25. They could not read every message, but they knew enough. American intelligence intercepted references to an upcoming operation targeting a location known only as AF. Rochefort suspected AF was Midway. To confirm it, he devised a simple deception. Midway transmitted an unencrypted message reporting a failure in its water purification system. Shortly afterward, Japanese intercepts mentioned that AF was suffering from a water shortage. The trap was set. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now knew where and when the Japanese would strike. Outnumbered and still recovering from Pearl Harbor, Nimitz faced a terrible choice. He could defend Midway and risk losing his remaining carriers, or withdraw and surrender the Central Pacific. He chose to fight. June 1942. The battle began. On June 4, 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Midway Island. The attack caused damage, but it failed to neutralize American defenses. Anti-aircraft fire remained fierce. Runways were damaged but not destroyed. As Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers for rearming, confusion erupted on the flight decks. Should they prepare a second strike against Midway, or rearm for a naval engagement against American carriers, rumored to be nearby? Bombs were switched. Torpedoes were moved. Fuel hoses lay across decks. Aircraft were crowded into hangars. It was at this precise moment that American carrier aircraft arrived. Flying from the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, American dive bombers descended almost unopposed. Japanese fighter cover had been drawn low by earlier attacks. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. A fourth carrier, Hiryu, launched a desperate counterattack that crippled the Yorktown. But later that afternoon, Hiryu too was found and destroyed. By nightfall, the result was unmistakable. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, the core of its striking power. Hundreds of experienced pilots and deck crews were dead. The Imperial Navy, once supreme, was crippled beyond repair. Midway was more than a defeat. It was a catastrophe. The shock in Tokyo, the scale of the disaster was so great that it was concealed from the army and even from much of the Navy itself. Official communiques spoke vaguely of losses and tactical reverses. Privately, Yamamoto was devastated. He had gambled everything and lost. The decisive battle he sought had come, but it had delivered victory to the enemy. Japan could no longer dictate the pace of the war. From this moment forward, it would react rather than lead. Yet even in defeat, The Japanese High Command refused to abandon its objectives. Instead, attention shifted south, the southern strategy. Even before Midway, Japanese planners had been preparing in advance toward Port Moresby, on the southern coast of New Guinea. Its capture would isolate Australia and sever Allied supply lines. In May 1942, that plan collided with American forces in the Battle of the Coral Sea. For the first time in history, two naval fleets fought without ever seeing one another. Aircraft carriers launched strikes hundreds of miles apart, with ships themselves remaining invisible. Tactically, the battle was inconclusive. Both sides suffered losses. Strategically, however, it was a turning point. Japan failed to capture Port Moresby. More importantly, the battle cost Japan experienced air crews it could not afford to lose. The American Navy, by contrast, was already training replacements at a scale Japan could not match. After Coral Sea and Midway, Japan's margin for error vanished. Still, the southward push continued. The road to the Solomons, with Port Moresby temporarily out of reach, Japanese planners looked east toward the Solomon Islands. Control of this island chain would protect Japan's southern perimeter and threaten Allied communication lines between the United States and Australia. In early July 1942, Japanese forces landed on Guadalcanal, a remote jungle-covered island largely ignored before the war. There, they began constructing an airfield. To Japanese planners, the airfield was defensive, a way to protect shipping lanes and support future operations. To the Americans, it represented an unacceptable threat. By this time, American intelligence was watching closely. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed the growing airstrip. Analysts concluded that once operational, Japanese bombers could dominate the surrounding seas. Admiral Nimitz faced another decision. The U.S. Navy was still weak. Only 3 fleet carriers were operational in the Pacific. Amphibious forces were inexperienced. Marines had never conducted a major opposed landing. Logistics were fragile. Command structures were untested. But waiting was not an option. America strikes back. In July 1942, Nimitz approved Operation Watchtower, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. The objective was simple: seize Guadalcanal and its unfinished airfield. The risk was enormous. If the operation failed, the U.S. Navy could lose its remaining carriers. If it succeeded, it would mark the beginning of a long, brutal counteroffensive across the Pacific. Few realized it at the time, but the fate of the war now hinged on a jungle island few Americans had ever heard of. As August approached, Japanese forces continued their preparations, unaware that American Marines were already on the move. The stage was set. By late July 1942, the Pacific War had entered a new and uncertain phase. The Japanese advance had stalled, but American strength was still fragile. The balance of power hung on a narrow edge, shaped by damaged ships, exhausted air crews, and commanders forced to gamble with incomplete information. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz studied reconnaissance photographs laid out across his desk. The images were unmistakable. On the northern coast of Guadalcanal, Japanese engineers were clearing land and leveling ground. An airstrip was taking shape. If completed, the airfield would place Japanese bombers within striking range of Allied supply routes to Australia. Convoys carrying men, fuel, and equipment would be exposed. Australia itself would become vulnerable. Nimitz understood the stakes. There would be no second chance. Operation Watchtower. The operation to seize Guadalcanal was codenamed Watchtower. It was conceived in urgency and executed under pressure. Planning time was measured in weeks, not months. Maps were incomplete. Intelligence was fragmentary. Many of the islands involved were little more than names on charts. The responsibility for the landings fell to Major General Alexander A. Vandergrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division. His men were tough, disciplined, and motivated, but they were also inexperienced. None had ever taken part in a large-scale amphibious assault. The Marines trained in New Zealand, under harsh conditions, drilling endlessly in landings, jungle movement, and defensive positions. Supplies were limited. Much of the equipment was outdated, yet morale remained high. They knew they were going first. Supporting them was a naval force assembled from nearly everything the U.S. Navy could spare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the amphibious group. Carrier air support was provided by Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, whose task forces included the carriers Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp. Together, they represented a fragile spear point, America's first real attempt to strike back. Japanese blindness. On the Japanese side, confidence bordered on complacency. Guadalcanal was lightly defended. The construction detachment consisted mainly of Korean laborers and a small number of Japanese naval personnel. The nearest major Japanese forces were hundreds of miles away. Japanese commanders believed the Americans were still reeling from Pearl Harbor and Midway. They expected no offensive action before late 1942, possibly even 1943. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. August 7, 1942. In the early hours of August 7, American warships approached the Solomon Islands under cover of darkness. The sea was calm. The air was heavy with humidity. Marines crowded transport decks, checking weapons in silence. At first light, American carrier aircraft roared overhead, striking Japanese positions on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. Bombs exploded across airfields, radio stations, and defensive positions. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. On Guadalcanal itself, resistance was minimal. As landing craft ground onto the beaches, Marines leapt into shallow water and advanced inland, expecting fierce opposition that never came.
The airfield was abandoned. Japanese personnel fled to the jungle, leaving behind equipment, food, and vehicles. By nightfall, Marines controlled the area and secured the runway. They renamed it Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine aviator killed earlier in the war. But victory on Guadalcanal was only half the story. The battle for Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. While Guadalcanal fell almost without resistance, the nearby islands told a very different tale. Tulagi, a small island that had served as a Japanese seaplane base, was defended by elite naval troops. They were well dug in, armed with machine guns, mortars, and heavy weapons. As Marines landed, they were met with immediate and intense fire. Japanese defenders fought from caves, bunkers, and hidden positions carved into coral ridges. They refused to retreat. Instead, they launched sudden counterattacks, often at close range. Combat became brutal, and grenades, bayonets, and flamethrowers were used to clear fortified positions. Casualties mounted quickly. Marines who had expected a swift victory now faced a determined enemy that showed no sign of surrender. Nearby Gavutu and Tanambogo proved even worse. These tiny islands were dominated by rocky hills, honeycombed with caves. Japanese troops occupied commanding positions and poured fire down onto American landing craft. Repeated assaults failed. Units were pinned down in open ground. Officers were killed trying to rally their men. Only after hours of savage fighting, and with the support of naval gunfire, did the Marines secure the islands. In many cases, Japanese defenders fought to the last man. It was here that American forces encountered the grim reality of Japanese warfare, a refusal to surrender, even when defeat was certain. The psychological shock was profound, a dangerous pause. By August 8, American forces held their objectives. The airfield was in Marine hands. Tulagi and the neighboring islands were secured at terrible cost. Yet the situation remained precarious. Supplies were still being unloaded. Ammunition stocks were limited. Heavy equipment remained aboard transports. The Marines had landed with only what they could carry, and beyond the horizon, the Japanese Navy was moving. Japanese response. News of the landings reached Japanese headquarters within hours. Shock quickly turned to fury. The American offensive was an unforgivable insult, a direct challenge to Japanese control of the southern perimeter. Immediate counteraction was ordered. Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa, commanding the Japanese 8th Fleet at Rabaul, assembled a powerful cruiser force and raced south under cover of darkness. His ships would pass through the narrow sea lane between island chains, a route soon to be known as the Slot. An American reconnaissance failed to detect Mikawa's force. As night fell on August 8, American sailors relaxed, believing the greatest danger had passed. Transports continued unloading. Crews stood down from battle stations. They were dangerously wrong. Carrier withdrawal. At the same time, Vice Admiral Fletcher faced his own dilemma. Carrier losses could not be replaced. Fuel levels were dropping. Japanese land-based aircraft posed a growing threat. On August 8, Fletcher made the controversial decision to withdraw his carriers from the area. The Marines were left without air cover. The transports would soon follow. General Vandegrift protested, but the decision stood. The invasion force was exposed on land and at sea. That night the Japanese struck. The calm before disaster. As darkness settled over the waters north of Guadalcanal, American and Allied ships lay scattered and unaware. Lookouts scanned the Black Sea. Radar was new and poorly understood. Command coordination was loose. The Japanese cruisers advanced silently, their crews trained in night fighting, their guns loaded, their torpedoes ready. Within hours the waters off Savo Island would erupt in fire and steel. The battle that followed would become one of the worst naval defeats in American history. Guadalcanal, it was now clear, would not be won quickly. It would be fought inch by land, by sea and by air. And the war for the Pacific had only just begun. The night of August 8, 1942, settled heavily over the waters north of Guadalcanal. The tropical heat lingered, the sea lay deceptively calm, and aboard Allied warships, tension slowly gave way to exhaustion. Many sailors had been at general quarters for days. Others believed the worst danger had already passed. They were mistaken. Moving silently through the darkness was Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa's cruiser force, advancing south from Roba. His ships, Chokai, Oba, Kako, Kinugasa, Furutaka, Tenyu and Yubari, were veterans of aggressive night operations. Their crews were highly trained, disciplined and confident. They had one objective: destroy the Allied naval forces protecting the Guadalcanal landing. The slot, Mikawa's ships, slipped through the narrow sea lane between island chains known as the slot. The road offered concealment by day and speed by night. Japanese sailors knew it well. Allied commanders did not. American and Australian ships were positioned in a loose, poorly coordinated screen around Savo Island. Communication between task groups was weak. Radar contacts were misinterpreted or ignored. Lookouts strained their eyes but saw nothing. Shortly after 1 on August 9, Mikawa's force emerged from the darkness. The first strike, Japanese flares burst overhead, bathing Allied ships in ghostly light. Moments later, torpedoes slammed into the heavy cruiser USS Chicago, ripping open her bow. Gunfire erupted. Searchlights swept across the water. Caught completely by surprise, Allied ships were hit one by one. The Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra was struck repeatedly and left burning, dead in the water. American cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, and USS Astoria were hit by devastating salvos at close range. Japanese gunnery was precise and relentless. Within minutes, Allied formations dissolved into chaos. Orders conflicted, signals went unanswered. Some ships never fired a shot before being crippled. The sea became a nightmare of fire, smoke and exploding ammunition. A crushing defeat. By the time Mikawa withdrew, the damage was catastrophic. 4 Allied heavy cruisers lay sunk or sinking. More than 1,000 sailors were dead. It was one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. Amazingly, Mikawa did not press his advantage. He feared daylight air attacks and lacked accurate intelligence on American carrier positions. Choosing caution, he withdrew north before dawn. His decision would later be debated endlessly. Had Mikawa continued south, he might have destroyed the Allied transports and doomed the entire Guadalcanal operation. But history would not give him a second chance. Aftermath on Guadalcanal. When news of the disaster reached shore, American commanders were stunned. Worse news followed. The transports were withdrawn. Supplies left on the beach were minimal. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, everything was short. Heavy equipment remained offshore. The Marines were alone. General Van de Grift faced an impossible task. He ordered his men to dig in around Henderson Field and prepare for Japanese counterattacks. There would be no retreat. Henderson Field, the airfield, became the center of the campaign. Captured Japanese equipment was hastily repaired. Aircraft were flown in as soon as possible. Pilots arrived with minimal ground support. Spare parts were scarce. The collection of American Navy and Marine aircraft based there became known as the Cactus Air Force, named after the Allied code name for Guadalcanal. Flying from Henderson Field was danger. Pilots faced relentless air attacks, poor weather and constant mechanical failures. Losses were heavy, yet the airfield held. As long as Henderson Field remained operational, the Japanese could not dominate the surrounding seas by day. The Tokyo Express, unable to transport large forces in daylight, the Japanese adapted. Fast destroyers began making nighttime supply runs down the slot. These missions became known to the Allies as the Tokyo Express. Destroyers could deliver troops and supplies but not heavy equipment. Artillery, vehicles and large quantities of ammunition could not be transported efficiently. Japanese soldiers arrived hungry, underarmed and exhausted. Still, they were ordered to attack. First, Japanese counterattacks. In late August, Japanese forces launched their first ground assaults against Marine positions near the Tanaru River. The attacks were poorly coordinated and based on gross underestimation of American strength. Japanese commanders believed only a few thousand Marines were present. They were wrong. The assaults were repelled with devastating losses. Entire Japanese units were wiped out. For the first time, Japanese ground forces experienced large-scale defeat against American troops. The psychological impact was severe. A war of attrition. As August turned into September, Guadalcanal became a battleground of exhaustion. Both sides struggled with disease, hunger and relentless combat. Jungle heat rotted equipment and bodies alike. Malaria spread rapidly. Supplies arrived sporadically and under constant threat. Naval battles erupted repeatedly in the waters surrounding the island. Aircraft clashed daily overhead. Neither side could secure complete control. The campaign settled into a brutal stalemate. But the strategic balance had shifted. Japan was now fighting a defensive war, one it could not afford. The cost of delay, every week that Guadalcanal remained in American hands, weakened Japan's position. Resources were drained, experienced pilots were lost, ships were damaged or sunk. The United States, by contrast, was gaining strength. New ships were being launched, new pilots were being trained, industrial output surged. Guadalcanal had become a test of endurance, and endurance favored the Americans. The road ahead. By September 1942, both sides understood the truth. Guadalcanal would not be decided quickly. It would be fought through months of grinding battles on land, at sea, and in the air. Victory would go to the side that could sustain the struggle the longest. The island that few had heard of before the war had become the focal point of the Pacific conflict, and the bloodiest phase was still to come. By October 1942, Guadalcanal had become a graveyard of ambition. What began as a bold Japanese expansion had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The island was no longer merely a strategic objective. It was a test of will, endurance, and industrial power. And it was a test Japan was slowly losing. The battle for the skies, control of the air over Guadalcanal determined everything. Each morning, Japanese aircraft flew down the slot from Rabaul to strike Henderson Field. Each afternoon, American fighters rose to meet them. The skies filled with twisting contrails, tracer fire, and burning wreckage, plunging into the jungle below. Japanese pilots were experienced and aggressive, but they were irreplaceable. American pilots, many of them barely trained, learned quickly or died. Losses were high on both sides, but the balance favored the United States. For every American aircraft destroyed, another soon arrived. Japan could not say the same. Every zero lost over Guadalcanal weakened Japan's future. Every veteran pilot killed could not be replaced. Naval battles of attrition. The seas around Guadalcanal became equally deadly. Throughout October and November, warships clashed repeatedly in night battles fought at close range. Radar technology gave the Americans a growing advantage, though they were slow to use it effectively. Japanese ships still excelled in night combat, but their losses mounted. The naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942 marked the breaking point. Over several nights, battleships, cruisers and destroyers collided in chaotic engagements. Ships were crippled at point-blank range. Admirals were killed on their bridges. Entire task forces dissolved into confusion and fire. When it ended, Japan had lost battleships, cruisers and destroyers it could not replace. Most critically, Japanese attempts to bombard Henderson Field failed. The airfield remained operational. Starvation and desperation. On land, Japanese soldiers suffered horribly. Supplies delivered by destroyers were insufficient. Rice rations were slashed. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies vanished. Disease ravaged the ranks. Malaria, dysentery and starvation killed more men than American bullets. Entire units were reduced to skeletal survivors, barely capable of combat. Still, Tokyo demanded attacks.
Japanese commanders launched repeated offensives against entrenched Marine and Army positions. Each assault ended the same way, with devastating losses. The Americans called it banzai charges. The Japanese saw it as duty. Neither side as duty. Neither side misunderstood the cost. American reinforcement. While Japan bled, America built. Fresh Army divisions arrived to relieve exhausted Marines. Artillery was landed. Tanks rolled ashore. Supply depots expanded. What had once been a fragile foothold became a fortress. The U.S. Navy tightened its grip on the surrounding seas. Japanese supply runs became suicidal missions. By December 1942, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The decision to withdraw. In Tokyo, reality finally broke through illusion. Senior commanders acknowledged the truth. Guadalcanal could not be held. In January 1943, Japan quietly approved Operation kept the evacuation of surviving troops from the island. Under cover of darkness, destroyers made one final series of runs down the slot, not to reinforce, but to rescue. American commanders initially mistook the withdrawal for another buildup. By the time the truth was clear, it was over. On February 9, 1943, organized Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal ended. The island was secured. The price of Guadalcanal was staggering. Tens of thousands were dead. Ships littered the seabed. Aircraft wreckage rotted in the jungle. But the strategic impact was even greater. Guadalcanal marked the first major, sustained Allied offensive victory of the Pacific War. It shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and proved that Japan could be defeated. More importantly, it changed the nature of the war. Japan would never again launch a large-scale offensive. From this point forward, it would fight defensively, retreating from island to island. Under relentless American pressure, the initiative had shifted permanently. Yamamoto's War. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Guadalcanal confirmed his darkest prediction. The war he had feared, a long grinding conflict against American industry, had become reality. Japan's window for negotiated peace had closed. In April 1943, Yamamoto himself would be killed when American fighters intercepted his aircraft, a blow from which Japanese morale never fully recovered. The architect of Japan's early victories did not live to see its final defeat. The turning point. Historians would later debate where the Pacific War truly turned: Pearl Harbor, Midway, or somewhere else. But for the men who fought there, the answer was clear: Guadalcanal. It was there that Japan lost not just ships and men but time, and time was the one resource it could never replace. From the jungles of Guadalcanal, the road now led north through New Guinea across the Central Pacific, and eventually to Japan itself. The war was far from over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt.